All right, good evening. Welcome, friends. Welcome, people, to our webinar this evening on cross-cultural agility. Most of us, many of you know us, Three Fish Consulting. We are in the space of assessment, coaching, and consulting. Many of you, of course, also know us as in our role as the distributors of Hogan Assessments. Today, we are going to present something different, though. It's still very much anchored in what we do, which is psychology, and it's still very much anchored into personality and individuals and how that comes across and how that impacts working. But this time, it's going to be focused a lot more in the cross-cultural domain. So again, sit back, relax. We have an hour of conversation with all of you. The way we're going to run this session is you are in a mute, audio mute mode. Your video is also off. So please feel free to use the chat to send messages to each other or add your comments, and use the Q&A to send any questions. Rucha and I will talk for at least about 30-40 minutes, and then we will make sure to get to your questions. At least try and leave about 15-20 minutes towards the end. So feel free to use the chat message to send messages to each other, use the Q&A and Q&A messages, Q&A to send in your questions, okay? So without further ado, let's begin. And our agenda for today, of course, is we'll begin by talking about the importance of cross-cultural agility. And as so much of global work is getting done in India, both in terms of offshore work as well as so many of Indian companies going global, this is absolutely a critical issue or a critical topic for all of us living in India. And I know today we are joined by friends not just in India, but also from people outside. And I think it's equally, which itself adds to the fact that the world is really flat and we are working pretty much cross-culturally all the time. So we'll begin by talking a little bit about the importance of cross-cultural agility. What does this concept mean? And then we'll begin to dive deeper into the 6 cultural competencies, as well as the 3 cultural orientations. And all of this comes from our friend Paula Caligiuri's work, who's been researching this area for many years, and we've been associated with her, and Rucha will take us deep into this. And then we'll end by sort of leaving you with ideas about how do you bring it into practice. Many of you are senior execs and leaders who are anyway dealing with global work. So what does it mean for you? I'm sure there'll be some takeaways, in fact, several takeaways as you look through the competencies as well as the orientations. At least we hope you'll have takeaways. And for those of you who are in the area of HR and leadership development, we hope to leave you with ideas about how you can build cross-cultural agility or more culturally agile leaders. So that's what we planned for today. And when you think about, cross-cultural agility and sort of why is it important, but beginning to think about it broadly, about what is this concept of cultural agility, right? And Rucha, the control is with you in slides. Thank you. So when you think about cultural agility, we are really thinking about 3 different aspects. The first is cultural understanding. And this, as Rucha likes to label it, it's sort of the outside-in perspective, which is, do we have an understanding of the cultural context? But before we go there, how do we define cultural agility? It's the ability to quickly, comfortably, and effectively work in different countries and with people from different cultures. And that's our operational definition of cultural agility. Now, it begins, as I said, outside in, which is an understanding of the context in which this work is getting done, the different cultural nuances of the environment in which the individual is working. And then the other aspect of cultural agility is what we call the inside out, which is what are the competencies, and these are derived more from sort of knowledge, skills, abilities of people, but essentially what are the sort of competencies. And the third piece is, of course, cultural experiences. So thinking about understanding of cultural understanding, how do we define that, right? So Richa, if you can move ahead, please. Cultural understanding, of course, therefore is, as I was saying, the understanding of both the technical aspects of the job, but also the cultural nuances of the context within which the global work is being done. Now, when you move to cultural competencies, which is then we are beginning to talk about individual skills, abilities. And so this is where we go deep into the individual, is what are the individual skills and abilities, and therefore how competent are they in terms of effectively dealing with the cross-cultural context. And moving on, therefore, to cultural experiences, anything we can do to create developmental experiences for our leaders or our people who need to work cross-culturally, anything we can do to create developmental experience, cross-cultural experiences, that absolutely is the third overlay that begins to help in terms of cross-cultural agility. So there is understanding, which is the outside-in piece of the cultural context. There is the competencies, which is the inside out, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of individuals. And of course, we are wired differently. And then the third piece is, of course, experiences. How much experiences have we had? And really, have we used these experiences developmentally? So have we used these experiences to learn something from that? Now, moving along then, when you think about cultural agility, what is it that we know? And as Dr. Paula Caligiuri often likes to comment, and this is a quote we take from a talk she presented recently in the People Matters L&D conference, is we are always making judgments. We are making judgments about people all the time, and it's done completely unconsciously, right? And it's very important for us to understand that these judgments are being made in a cross-cultural context all the time, because understanding this and having an awareness of this is the most fundamental aspect of building cross-cultural agility. And hence we begin with an understanding of the context, but even beyond that, understanding of the fact that we are unconsciously taking in all these cues, and then building awareness about how am I particularly wired and what are my competencies to deal in this scenario. Now, in the global area and global work, of course, today everybody is on Zoom, and one feels that technology is a solution to bring us together. And it is, and yet cross-cultural agility becomes even more important, because even though you feel you're connected through this Zoom meeting or through the calls, how are you building trust? How are you gaining credibility? Are you communicating effectively? Are you driving true collaboration? And at the heart of all of that really is the cross-cultural agilities. And I'm going to pause over here because, Rucha, do you want to add something, a few more comments over here in terms of the importance of cross-cultural agility as you take us sort of beyond this?
Sure. Thanks, Pradnya. So I think, the point that you made about communication platforms being sort of this go-to solution, let's get everybody face-to-face on Zoom or Teams or what have you, seems like such an easy solution, because then you have people sitting together and you can look at each other, and it gives us this sort of false sense of, hey, we're in the same room, and therefore we understand each other. And we sometimes forget the underlying cultural nuances that may be at play. So even though we are in this same virtual environment, there may be factors that are playing out in the background under the surface, which are much more, have more to do with the cultural environment that the person is sitting in, and we may just miss that because we are at this sort of surface.
We feel we are technologically sort of in that same space, and some of that physical distancing, the physical presence is not there, and so we might actually overlook some of those nuances. It almost makes me feel that they're becoming even more important, and paying attention to that is even more critical, because we don't have any of the other cues, right? We don't have the physical cues, we don't have the physical proximity. All we have is the virtual environments that we work on. So further highlights the importance of cultural agility. So who is culturally agile, right? So culturally agile professionals are those who are able to manage themselves in the international or multicultural situation. So here's what we call about is that self-management piece, being aware, being conscious about how they are interacting, how they are responding to the cultural context. Culturally agile professionals are the ones who are effective in terms of interacting with people from different environments and different cultural environments, cultural contexts, which is the relationship management aspect of cross-cultural agility. And then finally, culturally agile professionals are far more adept at making effective business decisions. And we'll talk about it in the context of task management competencies, of cultural orientations. And those are really heuristics which tell us what strategy is the best strategy. And we're all sort of wired to have a predisposition, but that may not always be the best response in a particular decision making scenario, which is a cross cultural scenario. And so, Richa, why don't you? I'm going to hand it over to you really to dive deeper into each of these three competencies and sort of, take us through.
Sure. Thank you, Pradnya. All right. So I think Pradnya mentioned, that both Pradnya and I have have known Paula for many, many years now. She was my professor when I was doing my master's. Pradnya has known her as a friend and as a colleague because they're both PhDs in psychology. And so we're really sort of inspired by her work. We find it extremely relevant in the business environment that we find ourselves in, particularly relevant for all of us who work in India. And so her framework really is 9 cultural competencies. And they are grouped into these 3 overarching buckets of self-management, relationship management, and task management. So when we look at self-management competencies, what we're talking about really is firstly a tolerance of ambiguity, right? So self-management competencies come into play at an individual level. How am I going to respond, react, and have cognitive functioning, or my cognitive perceptions, how are they going to play up when I'm placed in a multicultural environment or a global environment that perhaps I'm not very familiar with? So tolerance of ambiguity is the ability to be comfortable, effective in ambiguity, uncertainty, situations where I don't know what's going to happen next. So think of being put into, going to a foreign country where you don't know the language, you're perhaps not familiar with train timetables or schedules, and you're essentially relying on either the kindness of strangers or your ability to make hand gestures appropriately to make yourself understood. So how are you going to handle situations of uncertainty? The second one is resilience. This is the capacity to bounce back from challenges, from adversity, from obstacles that are in your way. And so resilience plays a role again when we find ourselves in global environments where we may not be 100% familiar with ways of doing things, where challenges come into play because we don't know cultural norms, or cultural norms and behaviors are colliding with what we think is the right way to do things. So resilience is very important in terms of how we bounce back. There's a concept here of culture shock, which I wanted to talk about, which I think plays very well with the competency of resilience. And typically, I think research has found that culture shock for people who are placed in global environments. I mean, I know we can't travel at the moment, but on expatriate assignments, that culture shock happens at about that third or fourth month mark, where the initial exhilarance of being in a new country and having all of these novel experiences suddenly sort of crashes for us. And that's where resilience can really, really come into play, because it helps individuals get through that little bit of a dip in enthusiasm. And then finally, we have curiosity under self-management, which is a genuine interest, a genuine desire to learn about different cultures, to learn about what makes people tick in these different environments, in different cultural contexts. So asking questions, having a sincere interest in understanding how things work, what are the different cultural norms, what are the different behaviors that make people function the way they do in that particular cultural context. So then we look at relationship management competencies. Relationship management is really about how we are able to build deep, meaningful connections with people who are from other cultures. And that, I think, is at the heart of being able to work with other people. So most of us are going to be working on teams that are perhaps global, multicultural in nature. And so it becomes very important for us to build those relationships, to build those connects, in order to create trust, in order to create, confidence. And Pradnya talked about that whole piece of building credibility as well. So what forms relationship management? The first competency is something called perspective taking. And this really is the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and to recognize that there may be multiple ways or multiple viewpoints towards a particular situation. Right? To recognize that perhaps my lens is not the only lens for viewing a particular cultural situation. The second one is humility. And with humility, really, we're not talking about, underplaying ourselves. Cultural humility is the ability to be open, to show some vulnerability, to go into a cultural situation and say, you know what, I don't know everything about this place, or there are some gaps in my knowledge. And so to have that openness, receptivity to feedback, receptivity to input from others, and to learn from their experiences and to learn from each other. Humility, actually, cultural humility can greatly, enhance our ability to have that, to have that perspective taking, right? To put ourselves openly into someone else's shoes, because I'm coming from a viewpoint of, look, I may not have all of the answers, and therefore I'm going to be open to seeing your point of view. And finally, we have relationship building, which is the ability to make true, meaningful connections with others. Genuine connections, right? Not the shallow, sort of professional, surface level connections that we might have when we're working with people on sort of a day-to-day basis, but to have this sort of genuine desire to understand where other people are coming from and to learn really more about them. So in fact, perspective taking and humility are the two sort of competencies which enhance our ability to build relationships with others. Because if I'm able to put myself in other people's shoes, and if I'm able to ask questions and be open to feedback with that cultural humility, I'm certainly going to be much better at making those connections. So that brings me to the golden rule. Right? I think everyone's read of the golden rule, which is treat others as you would want to be treated. However, in a cultural context or a global context, the golden rule really doesn't always apply. In fact, different cultures have different norms, different behaviors which are quote unquote acceptable. And so the assumption that what works for you or what your lens is the right way to behave would actually be incorrect. And in fact, the ability to remain curious, to remain flexible, remain open-minded is very, very important in cross-cultural contexts. So let's take a look at some common beliefs. Right? Read some of these statements or a few of these statements and think for yourselves about what your response might be. So for example, I would want a friend to accept and open a gift I give to him or her, might work in a particular cultural context. So for example, in Brazil, opening a gift that a person has given you is almost expected. But in Asian cultures, that probably would be rude. In fact, I've grown up, listening to my mother tell me, wait to open your gifts until everybody's gone away and left the party, because we don't do that. The third one, I prefer to be judged at work by my character and knowledge, not by my appearance. In Italy, for example, you would definitely be judged by your appearance. The viewpoint being, if you don't care to present yourself in a polished way, why should I trust you? The fourth one, I would want my personal space to be respected. Honestly, can be a little bit difficult in a country like India, where there are a lot of people, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of having your own little bubble around you. Right? And so that sort of leads into the fifth one, which is about not wanting to be touched by someone I don't know. So a culture in which being very tactile is sort of acceptable and shows warmth and connection may really put someone off or be very uncomfortable for someone who comes from a culture that doesn't believe in that. Time fluidity, I think, is a big one as well. And I've heard this example so many times about Indians and lateness and how time is sort of fluid. So if you tell someone there's a meeting at 9 o'clock, they may show up at 9:30 and honestly feel like they're not late at all. Whereas for someone to actually be 5 or 10 minutes before time would be to be on time for a particular meeting or an event. So that then brings me to task management competencies. So task management competencies actually come into play um, in enabling us to really respond effectively to situations, problem solving, decision making. How do we execute on tasks when we are faced with sort of implementation issues? So the way that we can also look at task management competencies is in terms of cultural orientations or cultural responses. What am I going to do, or how am I going to make decisions when I'm presented with a scenario or a task that I need to accomplish? So our three cultural orientations are cultural minimization. With cultural minimization, the approach is standardization. Right? There is a standard way of doing things regardless of culture. And if I'm the one who is approaching with cultural minimization as a lens or an approach, I'm going to pretty much come at it with do it my way. Like, my way is the right way to do it. It doesn't matter to me what your cultural context is. The second one, cultural adaptation, is the ability to modify one's approach. So with cultural adaptation, my lens is going to be, I'll do what works for you. So let's sort of do it your way. I will modify my approach. I will think of what works in your local context, in your local cultural environment, and we'll do it that way. And then the third one, cultural integration, is the creation of a completely new or unique way of working. So it doesn't really take into account any one particular culture. There is no dominance in terms of the culture. It's really about integrating. So there may be multiple cultures that are sort of either represented in a few ways, but there is no one particular culture which actually stands out. Most people will have one or maybe two of these that are a little bit dominant for them. So, I might veer towards cultural minimization as a response when I am when I have to approach problem solving or decision making. But a truly culturally agile professional is able to switch between the three as required. And that's really what makes that aspect of cultural agility important, right? This is, and the cultural orientations get built up through practice. So let's do a little bit of scenario, scenario setting, right, for you. So here we have an internationally headquartered company. They're opening a new manufacturing facility, and the headquarter company already has very detailed, very stringent safety policies in place. These processes are essentially designed to maximize safe behaviors, reduce workplace accidents, keep workers, in good health. And you have been instructed to replicate these processes exactly the way they are in this new facility, and then create an org-wide communication plan. So there are different approaches that we can take to completing this task. So our choices perhaps might be, we update policy documents according to these, the standards that have been set for us, and we send off an email to the entire organization saying, look, here are the changes, let's go ahead and do this. Our second option might be, we still update the policy documents according to the guidelines that have been set, but then we might schedule, forums or at least a platform for people to ask questions, get clarification, maybe, get some of their anxieties sort of cleared up. And then our last option might be, we say, you know what, we don't care about these norms or standards that are coming from a country that really doesn't know who we are. And so we just change the policies to suit local culture, and no need to have any kind of communication plan at all. So you might, as you're reading the choices, perhaps veer towards one or other, but we do have the right answer for you. In which case, we're looking at minimization. So where there is standardization in terms of uniformity for organizations, and I think safety policies are one of that is an example where we want standardization to happen. The best choice would be we update policy documents and then schedule forums for people to ask questions. So we're still working from a minimization lens, which is that, look, this is how it's going to be. These are the policies that we have to put into place. They are going to be implemented globally, and there can't be any change. We can't have any, we can't become lax in our standards. However, we are still going to recognize that people need an opportunity to create that alignment and get that buy-in, clear some of their anxieties. And so we'll go ahead and schedule perhaps some forums for people to come and ask questions so that they become more comfortable. Let's look at another scenario, which is we've been tasked with.
I'm just hopping in. It was interesting.
Yes. Please.
People were putting in their numbers. So maybe in this scenario, we can pause and invite people. Whether
that's a great idea.
Now that we walk them through the first scenario.
Sure. I think that's a great idea. Thank you. So yes, so we're tasked with creating an advertisement for locally launching an international product that's already been very successful in the home country. There's already an ad campaign in place. It's been created. It's been run very successfully in the home country. And so now our choices are, we're going to run the ad campaign exactly the same way in this local country, in the new country. Why reinvent the wheel? It's been a great success already. Let's just bring it in, run it the way we've run it. Our second option is we tailor the ad campaign to the local market and local consumer preferences. And then our third option is we create an entirely new campaign from scratch. So I'll pause here and give people the opportunity to choose. Pradnya, can I ask you to sort of comment on what people are saying?
So almost, predominantly twos, but a few threes as well. Create an entirely new campaign from scratch. So a good divide, but nobody's picking the first option, Rucha.
Fantastic. Folks are already thinking from a culturally agile point of view. So this is cultural adaptation at work. Right? So our best choice would probably be to tailor the ad campaign to the local market and consumer preferences. I mean, think of McDonald's, where they come into India, you can't sell beef, but they still have the Maharaja Mac. I mean, they have the Big Mac, and then they tailor it to, you have the same sort of look and feel for everything, but it is very much attuned to what the local market preferences are. And then finally, we have our third scenario. Here's where we're putting together a global team, and we have members from several countries around the world. This is a key project, and you have been tasked with setting standards around how this team is going to communicate, what are going to be the norms, how is performance going to be measured, what are the expectations for success for this new team. And so your choices are, first, we set team communication norms and performance expectations based on the headquarter culture. So we follow, whatever sort of that dominant HQ culture is going to be. Second, we set team communication norms and performance expectations based on your home country culture. And so if you are from India and perhaps company headquarters are, I don't know, in Belgium, but you have team members from UAE and you have team members from Australia and wherever else, you're going to say, I'm just going to do what we do in India. And then our third option is we create a standard, perhaps entirely new set of communication norms and performance expectations, which are common across all team members. And so everybody sort of aligns, integrates, and creates this new standard, right? New guidelines for how we are going to communicate and how we are going to measure what good performance looks like. So I'll give folks a little bit of time to choose. I think this should be an easy one.
I was on mute. Almost everybody is picking number 3.
Yeah. And absolutely. So our best response or our best choice in this scenario would be to integrate, which is create a standard and perhaps entirely new set of communication norms. So let me stay. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Richa. You were going to say something. I had a couple of questions for you on this, but
sure. So I wanted to stay really with, I'm going to, I'll stay on this slide, but I'll talk to the cultural orientations or the cultural responses, which is that even though we're talking about these 3 relationship management and the 3 self-management competencies, those are very much at an individual level. Those we develop in terms of, what can I do? How can I build that muscle for becoming a little bit more resilient, becoming a little bit more tolerant of uncertainty? How can I, reach out and build genuine connections? There, higher is better, right? The more agile I am at doing them, the stronger my competence is, the better it's going to be. With the 3 cultural responses or orientations, though, I need to develop the ability to choose the right response at the right time. And that essentially is going to come with practice, right? It's going to come with, some degree of trial and error, of seeing what works. And that's where, again, those self-management and relationship management competencies are going to come in and work together. So this framework really is pretty tightly sort of knit where, the competencies all sort of build off of each other. And you might find sort of nuances in how you're approaching the cultural orientations or how you're responding to certain situations. But I think I want to make the point again that cultural agility in terms of making effective business decisions is really about using the right response in the right place.
So, Richa, actually, my question was going to be, is there some underlying heuristic about what's more efficient? And do therefore people tend to lean one towards the other? Or are we saying it's predominantly what's hardwired into the individual making decision? Or do you think there is overlay of different cultures, which is, I'm talking about the company culture now.
Right.
That might be influencing some of these choices.
Right. I think at an individual level, the cultural orientations are to a certain degree formed or hardwired, right? Formed by our experiences, the way we process, how we're going to approach, particular task or how we're going to solve problems. And so that's really where that we need to zoom out a little bit, back up and say, oh, my first response is going to be, everybody's the same. We're all human. It doesn't matter. We live on planet Earth. And therefore, the way that I see things is going to be perfectly okay for Pradnya, even though she lives in a completely different country. So that's where my lens of minimization is going to overshadow some of the nuances that might come into play. That being said, we can still apply a certain set of guidelines to see where certain responses might actually be most valuable or, maybe the best choice. So we've given already, folks, we've given you an example of standards where I need for the policies to be or the approach to be the same across the globe. We're looking at global branding, for example, or safety standards. There, I might really want to use minimization, regardless of what my approach might be. Because there, I don't want to adapt to the local culture. I want to stick with standards. In terms of cultural adaptation, when we're thinking of brand marketing, for example, or we're thinking of sometimes even government regulations, we might need to shift a little bit because there might be different, policies in place which I need to adhere to. Think, PF and gratuity in India versus social security in the US. So I need to adhere to some of those norms. Even to simplify it even further, holidays. So I've heard from colleagues that work for multinational companies about how holidays need to be different. And so folks from the headquarter countries need to understand that in a place like India, you need to have more secular lists for annual holidays. So that might be a place where adaptation would be the right approach. Even though I might think, you know what, we do 12 holidays a year and I don't care if you have different sets of norms. And then for integration, really the best example of integration is global teams, where you have people from multiple cultures and you can't really have one single set of norms because that would not gel well with the way people communicate. That's not going to build trust. It's not going to build credibility. And so you need to come together and create a new set of norms.
Great, thank
I know
you.
that was a very long answer, Pradnya.
No, I think that was good. And Richa, I'm actually going to barge in and do something which is the new normal for us. And Naz, who's on the call, just texted me saying, I think there might be a doorbell ringing. You might not have heard it because you were busy presenting, and maybe your phone. If you need to
Okay.
address it, I'm here. I can, you can step away, take care of it, and I
That's
can.
okay. I am
Okay.
ignoring all of that. I'd rather be on the
All
webinar.
right. But if you needed to, I think, all our attendees, somebody come noticed it and said, so thank you, Naz, for that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Naz. But yeah, we can then move on. Another question, Pradnya?
No, I was just thinking sometimes minimization feels the most efficient way. And maybe
Yes.
we might lean towards that to say it's there, let's just, and we have words for that also, right? Lift and shift, copy paste. But just are we doing it consciously? I think is what your main takeaway is. And there are certain
Right.
right responses. Also, what came in the chat box, I think more. Uh, who so let me put my glasses, sorry, I'm like going back and forth with my glasses, but what came through on the chat and was yeah, Mohan put that across is sometimes even leadership competencies, we will say that we might want to have sort of minimization in terms of defining that, or corporate values, right, which is this is the way we build leaders in this company, or these are the core values that we hold sort of sacrosanct. And so those also seem to be sort of operating more from the minimization,
Right.
although maybe their demonstration requires a little bit of adaptation,
Right.
in terms of how they're perhaps manifested, or behaviorally the choices that are being made, right?
Right. Yep.
Great, thanks. So you want to take us through this piece as well, and then I pick up, or
Absolutely. So we've talked about what the cultural competencies are, but how do you develop them? And so it's like if we if I can use the analogy of sports, some people are going to be born with a little bit of an edge because they have a natural ability. They have that openness, and uh, they've had the advantage perhaps of having cross cultural experiences at an early age. Maybe they've traveled more, maybe they've moved around a lot. And so we all start perhaps at different places, but like any other skill or any other ability, we can develop it through motivation, through training, and through just sort of sheer, desire to do that. Like with um, any other training, right? Any other skill building, there are three aspects to how we can develop cultural agility. The first is awareness. Um, and that's Pradnya talked about it at the beginning of the webinar, where we have that outside in context. I need to understand the frameworks. There are different cultural frameworks that exist in the world. There are different behavioral norms that different countries have. And so an understanding that there are different, genuinely different ways that people behave across the world becomes that awareness of the outside in context. Then we have the inside out, which is the competencies, which is what we've talked about over the last 40 minutes or so, which is how am I going to respond? How am I going to build relationships? What is my approach going to be? So that framework of competencies that we look at. And then finally, for the folks out there who are a little bit more data oriented and science oriented, you can of course start with the foundation of an assessment, a personality assessment. And so, Paula has created a very nice, simple assessment called, it's a self-assessment called the CASA, it's Cultural Agility Self-Assessment. And it's a nice, simple report that you can use as a baseline. But then we move to the next step of that hard work, which is the insight piece. So now that I know I have this understanding of the frameworks and I have the awareness, how does that relate to me at an individual from a individual perspective? And that's where the insight piece comes in. And this is where we would do one-on-one feedback. So if you've done a report like the CASA, it always helps to work with somebody who understands the frameworks, who's certified. So for example, I'm certified, to read the CASA and debrief it for someone. So you might want to spend a little bit of time with me understanding, okay, what does this report say? Where are some of the areas that I might want to focus on first? Then we have group coaching. So you get people together who are going to either are already in multicultural contexts or are shortly going to be in multicultural concepts. And you prepare them to perhaps look at their own development as well as that whole outside in understanding and amalgamate the two so that they're going to be more effective and more successful. And then finally, you could do a workshop, right? So a much more expanded version of what we're doing in this webinar to really dive deep into those concepts and to tie some of the concepts in with the individual perspective as well. And then we move on to action, which is where the fun really starts, is the individual development. What am I going to do now? Now that I have the cultural understanding, now that I have an understanding of the framework of what I need to develop, and I've connected it with what my personal reality is, where do I stand against that framework? What do I want to do now? And so there's several ways that you could craft an individual development plan. And it really centers around what Pradnya spoke about in the beginning, which is that practice piece of it. Building cultural agility cannot be an event. I cannot go for one workshop and say, wow, I'm culturally agile. I can't go and attend one of those workshops or those day-long seminars which teach you where the fork and the knife is, and how do I bow or do I shake hands, and then say, okay, now I'm culturally agile. You have to practice it sort of on a daily basis. And so some of the ways that people can craft individual development plans for themselves is to think about truly developmental experiences, whether that's travel, whether that's learning a new language, whether that's exposing oneself very consciously to things and situations that one has not been exposed to before. Go try a new cuisine, go watch a foreign film, go connect with somebody who is from a completely different culture than you. And so that becomes that action piece. And so I think at this point, Pradnya, I'm going to hand it over to you to summarize. And I apologize, folks, for all the background noise.
No, that is the new normal. We just wanted to make sure you're okay, and nobody was trying to reach you urgently.
It's fine.
All right, so this is the CASA report that Rucha talked about. It's like a simple report, self-assessment that Paula's built, and certainly that can be used for the data heads amongst us. But really, I think what Rucha has been trying to make us aware of is that the framework, the self-management competencies, the relationship management competencies, and making people aware of the orientations. Even just presenting that and having people do some self-reflection. Sure, there's always, like we say, a self-efficacy bias. We always feel we are better than where we are. But the awareness helps. People can begin to go back and look at themselves and say, okay, where am I? And that these are the critical pieces. And so, it can be done even as simple as building some self awareness, or maybe getting people to have some conversations and begin to observe themselves. But a quick summary, therefore, is it is critical. Today, more and more work is all global, and having that agility goes beyond just understanding how I handle myself in a new culture that I'm moving into. We don't by any chance minimize or say that that's not important. Of course it's important, but what we're talking about over here is a leadership competency of cultural agility, which goes far beyond just understanding and knowing how I handle myself in a different culture, to really these core competencies of relationship management and self management, and then becoming aware of the three orientations and what am I more likely to do, and also what is likely to be more appropriate. Um, we also want to leave you with the thought that, like any skill, actually, if you begin to think about cultural agility as a skill, it can be built. It can be built with awareness and creation of those insights, and then action planning and developmental experiences. And this is where the 9 cultural agility competencies can provide a very useful, pragmatic roadmap to start building culturally agile leaders within your own company. Um, so with that, we want to sort of, there are a couple of additional resources. You can come ask us for that, but there is really, we want to move to Q&A. And Rucha, some of the questions have been coming in. So let me start there. And folks, please have your, start sending us your questions through the Q&A box. I'm going to wear my glasses. And if I don't get to all the questions that I have here, we'll make sure to answer it later. But there was one question that came in that I think is very relevant, which is about how about conflict resolution from a cross-cultural perspective? So how do those self-management and relationship management competencies come into play, for example, when there's a conflict scenario? Any thoughts on that?
So I think Pankaj has asked this question, right? The way I see it, when we are starting with conflict resolution from a cross-cultural perspective, the first thing that's going to come into play is our self-management. Am I going to be resilient enough to be able to take those challenges? Because this is going to be a challenging situation. It's going to appear to be a setback. And so my response could either be to throw my hands up and say, my God, these people, for any of those folks who've read Asterix, these Gauls are crazy. Or it could be about, this is something that I perhaps need to manage a little bit better. So I need to regulate my own emotions and then approach it from a different angle, which then takes us to that relationship management competencies piece, which is, am I going to then be open to sort of understanding the other's perspective? Am I perhaps missing some nuance that I may not have seen? Is there a different cultural lens at work here? So I'll give you another sort of example of how those frameworks and that cultural understanding can sometimes also help in that perspective taking piece, which is, in Japan, people might close their eyes when you're speaking. And that's actually showing a way of sort of listening to you, right? They're paying attention. But in Brazil, they might interrupt you and ask questions and be very challenging while you're speaking. Two completely different approaches. I might take them as, this isn't working for me, depending on what my lens is. But in Brazil, that's a sign of respect and it's a sign of engagement if I'm asking you questions. Whereas in Japan, if I were to interrupt somebody, they would take that as a sign of disrespect. So I think that's also where, again, that perspective taking, the humility to ask questions, to be actually genuinely open to the answers, right? That's where I think that agility really helps. Hopefully that answers the question, Pankaj.
Richard, there's one more question that had come in. I thought that's a very interesting take on this, if I'm understanding the person correctly, but I'm going to read it the way it's been written, which is, can we be termed culturally insensitive if a person from a foreign culture wants to learn about our culture, but we keep treating them as their culture would allow it?
Yeah. um, I don't know. I think it depends. It depends on, um, I don't know. It depends on perhaps what our degree of relationship with that person is, what exactly it is that they want to learn about our culture, how they're going about it. But that said, if I'm the host and a person from another culture is coming into sort of my culture and really wanting genuinely to learn about it, then perhaps maybe if I'm not allowing them the opportunity to see some of those nuances and openly share, maybe I could be perceived certainly as culturally insensitive.
Right. Okay. There was one more question that came in on the chat box. There is a situation where headquarters team doesn't want to accept India cultural element. How to handle this scenario? I know it's very specific, but I'm going to genericize it. I think it always gets to whether it is, and it's not just about American or foreign companies operating in India. It's the opposite is true as well, folks. More and more Indian companies are going global. In fact, we work with many of them, and we work with many of their global leaders, and who are of different nationalities, and we coach them, right? It's just basically a tussle between headquarters. What does headquarter want versus what does the local want? In that context, Richa, you want to just take a stab at sort of giving people the perspective? I think it gets back again to individuals in a way, right?
Sure,
Sometimes.
sure. Let me give my tongue-in-cheek answer, which is send them a recording of this webinar. Uh, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
but I think, and I've honestly heard about this scenario very often in exactly the way that you framed it, Pradnya. It's that, it's a US organization or a European organization, which is the headquarters, the company that sort of sets the global standards. And there's always this little tussle and back and forth and pull between what India wants to happen, and we sort of seem to have to bow down. It really, I think, does come back to having those conversations. Having that, um, I guess, having the ability to somewhere stand our ground and push through, or be again resilient in continuing to have those conversations, because this is not an easy question to answer. There are a lot of things at play. There are going to be a lot of individual differences at play as well. So how culturally agile is the person that you're working with? It may be someone who's been with the organization for 15 years, totally mired in headquarter culture. And so your journey probably to have that open conversation, to build that relationship, is going to be a little harder. So I think it's certainly not easy to have uh, this culturally agile lens to build it. Um, but I think it's ultimately very rewarding. I think it would be. So, in a nutshell, it's going to be a conversation that's certainly difficult to have, but coming at it from a more sensitive place in the way you are communicating may help you to make a little, few inroads, to
Yes.
bring up the fact that maybe there is some cultural difference at play, and maybe that's never even occurred to people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's power in the task management competencies you talked about, or the three orientations.
Right.
Frankly, for me, until I had, 4 5 years ago, when I first got sort of looked at Paula's work and, got certified, so to say, in it, it gave me a language, and I felt that I wish I had this when I used to run a country HR head, and when I ran country HR for India, and I didn't have the language, right? That what am I trying to do? Because I would forever be accused, or I can, it works both ways. Headquarters will say you're trying to over dial for India, and India would say you're trying to over dial for the US. But the truth is, you're trying to find your way in between, but you didn't have a framework. And I think the cultural minimization, adaptation, and integration gives such a powerful language, folks, that as Rucha is saying, it's about educating or talking. Feel free to use that framework. And also, then the debate then moves from what I want and what you want to what is the appropriate strategy in this scenario.
Right.
That's where you want to shift the debate. Otherwise, we get stuck in it's not me, it's you and me. But it's not about the you and me. It's really about what's the appropriate response in this particular scenario. If the values are non negotiable and cannot be compromised, then yes, that is a minimization kind of a strategy. Versus some HR policies might be more about either an integration or even an adaptation, where we create something entirely new. So I think the framework allows the conversation to shift to strategy and how does it match the scenario versus what I want and what you want. Okay, we have time for maybe just one final question, real quick. Lucha, I think it'll be an easy answer, but if there are teams coming together from different countries, let's say acquisition, merger, you suggest maybe using like tool like CASA in a group, like a team profile? Could that be used, or some kind of a team, say a group facilitation with that? Going
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that would be an excellent approach to bring teams together, to see where the different baselines for people might be, and use that as a jumping point for um, creating that cultural understanding and marrying it, so to speak, with where people are in that cultural agility on that spectrum.
Great, super. So, folks, it's been wonderful having all of you here. I think we are just about on that time of 8:30 India, which is where we promised we are going to conclude the webinar today. So again, wonderful having you here. If any of this work interests you, drop Rucha or me or Ambika an email. Some of you were interested in getting a recording. If you want that, again, drop us an email and we'll see what we can do. But again, wonderful having you here and wonderful for being such an interactive audience with all the comments coming through and the questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.